All right. Welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah.
You know how this works. You send in the sources and we
dive in.
we take a look.
We go deep.
Yeah, we try to pull out the good stuff.
Extract those golden nuggets.
That's it.
For the listener.
A learner.
Who wants to get a handle on this stuff.
Yeah.
And do it without feeling completely overwhelmed.
Quickly and deeply, right?
Quickly and deeply, yeah.
Without getting lost.
That's the goal.
I love it.
So today...
This is a good one.
This is a really good one.
Yeah, this is exciting.
This is a framework, really, from Ralph D. Winter.
Yes.
And it's looking at, he calls them the two structures of God's redemptive mission, which is a mouthful.
It is.
But we're going to unpack that.
Absolutely.
Now, one of you sent this in.
Yeah, one of the learners sent this in, and we were just blown away.
Yeah.
Really important stuff.
And just to kind of give you the high-level overview.
Yeah, he's really pointing to these two essential structures that he sees.
That have shaped Christian history.
Yes.
And still.
All throughout history and still today.
Huge.
One being the local church.
Right.
And then these other mission-focused organizations.
Right, yeah.
And he gives them names, which we're going to get into, which I think are helpful.
Yeah, super helpful.
But what I thought was so interesting about this
is
he's not just saying, oh, this is a modern development.
No.
He's tracing this pattern.
All the way back.
All the way back to the New Testament.
The New Testament, yeah.
And then he sees how it echoes.
Through church history.
Yes, throughout church history.
Really neat.
So that's what we're going to do in this deep dive.
I love it.
Is to try to understand these two structures.
Yeah.
What makes them distinct, why he thought they were both absolutely crucial, and how their interplay has driven and sometimes hindered the spread of the Christian message.
The Great Commission. Yeah. Really fascinating stuff.
So let's start at the very beginning.
Okay.
The New Testament period.
Okay, so Winter starts off by looking at the New Testament. And he makes this kind of proposal. What we would call the New Testament church, he says, functioned much like a Christianized synagogue.
And that makes a lot of sense.
It does.
Because when you think about Paul's missionary journeys, he's always going to the synagogue.
Right. He goes to the existing Jewish synagogues across the Roman Empire.
Yeah, so it's not like he's trying to invent like a totally new religious institution.
Yeah.
He's going to where people already are.
Exactly.
And he's trying to basically clarify for them, for the Jewish people, and the God-fearers, the Gentiles who are already attending, that Jesus was in fact the Messiah. And there was a new and ultimate authority in Jesus.
Yeah.
And so this new understanding in Jesus, this almost like an authority that superseded Moses in some ways, right? Was really what allowed the Gentiles to be welcomed in fully without needing to convert to all the Jewish cultural practices and the law.
Yeah, without full cultural assimilation to Jewish law.
No, and it wasn't just like they were adapting existing synagogues. Winter also points out that eventually, like entirely new fellowships that resemble synagogues, but composed mostly of Greek-speaking believers, began to spring up.
That's right.
And one thing that Winter points out that I think is easy for us to overlook is that there were Jewish evangelists spreading their faith throughout the Roman Empire. Actively. Before Paul ever shows up.
And this had been going on, I mean, for a century before Christ.
Wow.
Even Jesus in the Gospels. Remember, he talks about these people who, would go to huge lengths to win one convert.
Right.
So this is, I mean, we often think of Paul as kind of the initial
trailblazer.
The trailblazer, yeah.
But really, he's operating within
this pre-existing religious landscape.
Yeah, and James even says Moses is preached in every city.
Right.
So these networks are there.
Yeah.
And the synagogue structure is there. And it's almost like they provided a launching pad for Paul's work.
Absolutely.
And it's not just that he's visiting these places.
Yes.
Winter emphasizes that Paul's activity was in actively establishing these new synagogue-like communities as the basic unit of his missionary effort.
That's right.
So this is one structure.
Okay.
And one of the things that he really points out is that it's inclusive.
Yeah, this first structure, the New Testament church, if you will, modeled on the synagogue, is really marked by inclusivity.
Yes.
It naturally includes all ages, genders,
Everyone.
Everyone, part of the same body in a particular place.
Okay, so that's one structure.
All right.
a local inclusive community of believers.
Okay.
But then winter identifies a second structure.
Yes, he does.
In the New Testament, that is very different.
Yeah,
And this is Paul's missionary band.
that's right.
So now we're getting into
Yeah.
okay, so our understanding of what exactly the organizational structure was of the pre-Pauline Jewish proselytizers
Right.
is limited.
Yeah.
But, they were obviously, given their widespread activity, they were operating in some kind of organized fashion.
Some kind of organized fashion, yeah.
Right.
And then when you get to Paul and his colleagues, of course, you have much more information
Yeah.
about how they operated.
So he's commissioned by the church in Antioch,
Right.
but then once he and his team are kind of out there on their journey, they become largely self-sustaining.
Yeah, they relied on support, of course, from the churches they had helped establish.
Right.
But not on Antioch solely,
Yeah.
right?
So that's interesting.
And this missionary band, Winter's point is, it was more than just an outreach arm.
It went
The Antioch church.
It was a distinct entity.
It was a distinct entity. Yeah, a team of committed, experienced individuals, and this represents, for Winter, what he calls a second decision.
A second decision.
Yeah, so beyond church membership,
Right.
there's this deeper level of commitment.
Okay, so we have the local church that kind of encompasses everybody.
Everybody.
And then we have this much more focused,
Yes.
mobile team dedicated to spreading the message.
Exactly.
Now, this is where Winter's analysis, I think, gets really interesting.
It does.
He's arguing that neither of these structures
Yeah.
was like kind of a divinely dictated blueprint.
No, handed down from on high.
Yeah, handed down from heaven, right?
Right.
And he's saying that God wasn't creating these organizational forms out of nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, he was utilizing existing patterns that were already present in Jewish society.
The synagogue, for example, is this local fellowship.
The local fellowship.
Right, and then you have this evangelistic band as reaching out beyond those communities. And I think it's really insightful the way Winter puts it. He says God was working within the cultural context.
Within the cultural context.
Yeah.
And he even draws this parallel to the use of the Greek language in the New Testament.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Words like kurios, right?
Yeah.
Which had this pagan origin.
Right.
Right? But were adopted and infused with new Christian meanings.
So it's like they're using the common language of the day to communicate the message.
That's right.
And in the same way, they're using existing social structures and they're adapting them.
They are.
Right. To serve their purpose.
Exactly.
And this leads Winter to say something really important, really kind of a real world implication of all this, is that the New Testament gives us functional patterns.
Yeah, functional patterns.
Not rigid forms.
Not rigid forms.
It's not be replicated, exactly.
Exactly. I mean, this reminds me of Kraft and his work on dynamic equivalence versus formal replication.
Talk about that a little bit, because I think that's helpful.
So what Winter's saying, drawing on Kraft, is we're not trying to just create exact copies,
right,
of a first century synagogue or Paul's missionary band.
Right.
We're looking for comparable structures, right, that fulfill the same underlying function.
Right. So it's about the core purpose.
It is.
And how that's achieved.
Yeah.
Not the exact
outward appearance.
Yeah,
think of it like translating a message, right?
Yeah.
You want to convey the meaning, not necessarily the same words.
Okay. So that makes a lot of sense.
It does.
So as we move through history, how did these structures then evolve as Christianity spread into the broader Roman culture?
Okay, so initially the synagogue pattern continued as a Christian structure.
Okay.
Right. However, it encountered some significant challenges, primarily from the increasing rivalry between Christians and Jews, right, which sometimes led to persecution, and also because Christians lacked the official recognition from Roman authorities that Jewish synagogues enjoyed.
So the more independent synagogue model began to give way to something different within the Roman Empire.
Precisely.
Okay.
The Christian structure became increasingly assimilated to the Roman administrative model.
Okay.
Bishops began to gain authority over multiple congregations within defined territorial jurisdictions, mirroring the Roman civil government.
Okay.
This is where the diocese as a unit of church administration develops.
Okay. And then what we call the local church then becomes known as the parish.
Right. Exactly.
But even with this move toward a more kind of hierarchical structure, the parish church still maintains this basic, Winter calls it, this modality characteristic, but bringing together all ages and genders within a specific locality.
That's right.
Okay, so now we're moving from synagogue to parish.
Right.
But it's still maintaining that core function.
It is.
Okay.
And meanwhile, a second type of structure emerged in this era.
Correct.
And this was the monastic tradition. And it's important to note, Winter says that this had no direct historical link to Paul's missionary bands.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So where did monasticism come from?
So Winter says its roots are actually surprisingly more connected to Roman military organization than they are directly to earlier Christian forms.
Okay.
So consider figures like Pachomius, right? He was a former soldier, and he attracted thousands of followers to this disciplined communal life.
Wow.
And his ideas significantly influenced later figures like Basil of Caesarea and John Cassian, who further developed and popularized these monastic structures, especially in the western part of the Roman Empire.
So the monastery offered then this kind of a second-level choice, as Winter puts it.
Yeah, a deeper,
more focused commitment.
A deeper, more focused commitment, yeah. So you can kind of see the parallel in that sense to Paul's missionary band.
Right, okay.
Right, so this is something distinct.
Right.
It's a second decision.
A second decision.
And Winter makes a really important point here, especially for folks who come from a Protestant background.
Yeah.
You know, the idea of monasteries, right, can often evoke...
Oh, yeah, all the negative.
Yeah, all the negative images.
From the late medieval period.
From a late medieval period, right.
Yeah.
He urges us to avoid those simplistic stereotypes and to remember that the monastic tradition spanned 1,000 years.
Right.
You know, there was incredible diversity.
Yeah.
And it made some significant positive contributions.
Yeah, like what? Give us some examples.
Yeah, so for example, Winter references a Baptist missionary scholar who points out how, for instance, the rule of Benedict actually elevated the dignity of manual labor.
Which was a pretty revolutionary concept in the ancient world.
Extremely revolutionary.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so monasteries became vital centers of agricultural innovation, land reclamation, road construction.
So this idea of the monks like fleeing the world is kind of shattered by this, right?
It is.
Because they're actually
very much engaged.
In culture building.
Absolutely.
And even more, I think, compelling for people interested in missions is this example of the Irish Peregrini,
these Celtic monks
who undertake these missionary journeys. Yeah. And they played a pivotal role, he says.
They did.
In evangelizing the Anglo-Saxons.
And a large part of Western and Central Europe.
Yeah. So these monastic communities are not just like in their monasteries.
In
their enclaves, right. They're actually
they're out there.
They're actively involved in outreach and mission.
Yeah.
And Winter makes a really important point that this second structure, these monasteries in their various forms, was actually essential for the continuity of Christian tradition throughout the centuries.
Wow, that's a huge point. Yeah, even, figures who are highly regarded by Protestants, right? Like Jerome, Augustine, Calvin, these folks were deeply influenced by or emerged from this monastic context.
Yeah, you can't tell the history of Christianity without these structures.
No.
And the very transmission
of Scripture.
And
theological thought.
Might have been radically different.
Yeah, I mean, we might not even have the Bible as we know it without these structures.
So by the 4th century, you've got these two
functionally similar,
formally distinct structures. Okay. Yeah. The diocese evolving from the synagogue pattern and the monastery arising from this different cultural influence.
Right.
And Winter actually, he uses terms to describe these structures that are super helpful.
Play it on us.
He calls the first type the diocese, the modality.
Okay.
And the second type, the monastery, the sodality.
Okay.
And he wants to use these terms throughout the rest of his analysis to describe their ongoing function. You give us just like the little definition of those two so people can keep them straight.
So a modality.
Modality.
Yeah, a modality is a structured fellowship that doesn't differentiate based on age or gender.
Okay.
Think of a local community, a parish church, right? It's just everybody in a particular place.
Okay.
A sodality, on the other hand, is a structured fellowship that requires a further, often adult decision beyond simply belonging to the modality.
Okay, so you have to opt in.
You have to opt in, right. Yeah. So sodalities often have specific criteria for membership.
Got it.
Sometimes based on age, gender, or marital status.
Okay.
So think of a professional organization,
Right.
or in a religious context, a mission agency, a monastery, right?
Got it.
And importantly, Winter notes that these sodalities are generally regulated,
Okay.
but not directly administered by the broader modalities.
Okay, so there's a distinction there.
There is. So he
Yeah.
uses the analogy of a town, the modality, having regulations for businesses,
Right.
which would be sodalities. Sodalities, okay.
But not running them day to day.
Right.
So the town doesn't go in and tell the business how to operate,
Got it.
but they do regulate them.
Okay, so that distinction between regulation and administration
Yes,
is really important.
it is.
Now let's move into the medieval period.
Okay.
Okay, so what happens as the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, starts to decline?
Okay, well, the governmental structure of the Roman diocese collapses.
Okay.
And because the Christian diocesan structure had mirrored it,
Yeah,
it also faces significant instability.
that makes sense.
Right. The monastic, or the sodality pattern, proves to be much more durable
Really?
and actually gains even greater prominence during this period.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you have the further complication of many of the invading groups who held Arian theological beliefs.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Right. So the survival of diocesan Christianity is further complicated
Wow.
by that fact.
So the monasteries become even more critical
Yeah.
during this time. Really important for preserving,
We're preserving.
propagating Christianity
Yeah.
during this era of upheaval.
Wow. Okay.
And Winter illustrates this interplay between modality and sodality
Okay.
with the example of Gregory the Great.
Gregory the Great.
Yeah, the Bishop of Rome.
So leader within the modality structure,
Absolutely.
and Augustine of Canterbury,
Right, the monk.
who represents the sodality
Yes,
in the mission to England.
to England, right.
And it's so interesting because Gregory wants to establish
He does.
diocesan Christianity
He does in England.
in England, but even though he's the Pope,
Even though he's the Pope,
he doesn't have a ready-made structure
he doesn't have a structure to deploy.
to deploy for this mission.
And so his most effective option is to leverage the existing sodality structure,
Which is,
which is the Benedictine monastery.
okay, so he commissions Augustine and a group of monks
That's right.
to undertake this mission.
The significant mission.
Wow, and Augustine's a monk.
He-
But the goal is actually to establish...
A diocesan structure in
Right.
England.
Wow.
Yeah. And the Benedictine rule itself, it becomes so influential that even the existing Celtic monastic communities, they adopt it.
Wow. So for a significant period,
Yeah.
roughly 1,000 years,
Roughly 1,000 years.
these sodalities, including monasteries and later movements like the Cluniacs, Cistercians, Friars, Jesuits,
Mm-hmm.
these were the primary drivers of renewal and vitality for the broader diocesan church, what we call the Corpus Christendom.
That's right. That's right.
And while there were obviously tensions
Yeah.
and rivalries between bishops and abbots, dioceses and monasteries,
Sure.
the Roman Church largely achieves this functional synthesis,
They did.
where these two structures can operate together
Yeah.
without causing irreparable conflict.
Without causing irreparable conflict. And Winter suggests that this ability to integrate modality and sodality remains a significant organizational strength of the Catholic Church today.
Right.
Even today.
But it wasn't always peaceful coexistence.
No, it wasn't.
Winter points out that neither structure held continuous dominance.
Right.
And organizational continuity wasn't always straightforward.
It wasn't, but he makes this point that the sodality frequently acted as the structural prime mover,
Okay.
the source of fresh inspiration and reform that even influenced the papacy itself.
Okay.
So he gives the example of Hildebrand,
Okay.
who became Pope Gregory VII,
Okay.
bringing monastic ideals and a commitment to reform directly into the Vatican.
It's almost like the monastic tradition, the sodality, is the engine
It often is.
behind a lot of the developments that we associate with a kind of the established Roman church structure.
Yeah, in some ways, yes.
Okay.
And this is reflected in the historical distinction between what they called regular priests,
Okay.
so those belonging to monastic orders and bound by a regula or rule,
Right.
and secular priests,
Okay.
who served within dioceses and parishes. And Winter highlights a recurring tension here,
Okay.
which is the potential for what he calls secularization.
Okay, what does he mean by that?
So this is where mission-focused sodalities can come under the complete control of ecclesiastical authorities,
Okay.
potentially diluting their specific mission focus
Right.
because of the broader range of concerns held by modality members.
So it's like there's this constant tension between like the people who are really focused on
The mission.
on a mission
Out there on the edge,
Yeah.
and then the people who are kind of running the machinery
of the institution.
of the broader institution.
Okay, so that's really interesting.
Yeah, and Winter also mentions these unofficial
Right.
and often persecuted movements.
Mm-hmm.
During the medieval periods, you have groups like the Waldensians, right?
Right.
Where the Bible itself played a central role in sparking renewal.
Yeah. Okay.
And then he also talks about the emergence of believers' churches,
Okay.
like the Mennonites, the Salvation Army, as this kind of fascinating structural development.
Okay.
So these often possess the family-oriented membership of a modality,
Right.
but in their early stages, they can exhibit the dynamism and selective commitment characteristic of a sodality.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and they're aiming for this pure church community.
Okay, so when we look back on that 1,000 years, that medieval period,
Yeah.
Winter concludes that the endurance and quality of Christian faith during that time
Mm-hmm.
is largely attributable to the vital role played by the sodalities,
That is sodality.
not just the kind of the formal structures centered in Rome.
That's right. And he points out that the events in Rome were only part of the story.
Right.
The real vitality often originated from these diverse sodalities,
Right.
which sometimes even operated in opposition to the Roman hierarchy.
Right. Okay. So now we're moving into the Reformation.
The Reformation.
And this is where Winter's framework, I think, gets particularly illuminated.
It really does.
He argues that the Protestant movement initially
Yeah.
attempted to operate almost entirely
Without sodality.
without sodalities.
That's right. And this is really interesting.
Yeah.
Because Martin Luther himself had become deeply aware of the contrast between the vibrant spiritual life he experienced within his own Augustinian monastic order
Right.
and what he perceived as the more nominal faith prevalent in the local parishes.
Right.
And so in his initial reform efforts, he essentially moved away
Away from that.
from the sodality structure.
Yeah. Which is so ironic
It is.
because it was in the context of monastic life that he encountered
He encountered the scriptures.
the scriptures and
Yeah.
the core teachings of justification by faith.
Exactly.
And so while the Reformation eventually leads to the establishment of
Lutheran
diocesan structures,
diocesan structures.
right, mirroring the Roman model,
Right.
it didn't in a comparable way reestablish.
Yeah. Or fully embrace religious orders or similar sodality-like structures.
And Winter sees this as a major misstep.
He calls it the greatest error of the Reformation and the greatest weakness of the resulting Protestant tradition.
It's a huge statement.
It is, and he contends that if it hadn't been for the Pietist movement,
Yeah, okay.
Protestantism would have been severely lacking in any organized structures for renewal and outreach.
Okay.
So the Pietist movement, with its emphasis on a conscious adult commitment to deeper spiritual goals
Okay.
within the existing church framework, function very much like a sodality.
Okay, so you see this in like the early work of John Wesley,
Absolutely.
the East African revival.
Yeah.
These are movements of dedicated individuals operating within
Revitalizing the broader church structure.
Right, but Winter points out that these pietist movements and also Anabaptist communities,
Right.
they often had a tendency to eventually revert towards the modality level,
That's right.
focusing on biological growth.
Yeah.
And becoming more like typical congregations.
Typical congregation.
And in many instances, they lost their initial effectiveness
yeah.
as kind of these dynamic mission-driving or renewal forces.
Exactly.
And so what was the consequence of this relative absence of a strong sodality tradition in early Protestantism?
Well, Winter suggests that they essentially lacked an effective mechanism for engaging in missions
Wow.
for nearly 300 years.
That's staggering.
It's huge.
Yeah.
It is, and so it wasn't until William Carey's groundbreaking work and inquiry,
Yes.
right, that the imperative for the use of means for the conversion of the heathen
Right.
was forcefully articulated.
Yeah, the use of means.
The use of means.
And by means, Carey specifically envisioned the creation of sodalities.
Yes.
These organized, non-ecclesiastical initiatives.
Driven by passionate believers,
Yeah.
committed to a specific mission.
And the formation of the Baptist Missionary Society as a result of this becomes this pivotal moment.
It does. It sparks the creation of numerous
Similar societies.
similar societies, yeah.
And it ushers in what Latourette famously called the Great Century.
The great century of Protestant missions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the 19th century witnesses this explosion.
Of Protestant missionary activity.
And Winter notes that this coincided with a period of relative decline in Catholic missions.
So the Protestants are finally catching up.
They are, after centuries of limited engagement.
After centuries of basically not being active on a global scale.
That's right.
And the Sodality structure.
Yes.
This organizational vehicle for voluntary association around a shared mission is the key.
Here's the key
to this Protestant resurgence.
That's right.
So we see this proliferation of mission agencies in the U.S., in England, in Scandinavia.
Yeah, what Winter terms the evangelical empire.
The evangelical empire, okay.
But he also points to, early signs of tension.
Oh, yeah.
And even opposition to these independent sodalities.
Right. Emerging from within the established Protestant churches?
Yeah, okay, so the relationship between these mission-focused sodalities.
Right.